Hi True Crime family, my name is Manju and welcome back to my channel where we talk about true crime cases from around the world. Today we're going to be traveling to Australia. Now this case is notorious. If you talk to any Australian, 99% of the time they know about this case. Old or young, they've heard about it even if it's just little snippets. This horrific crime not only scarred the residents of the small town of Prospect, New South Wales, but also all of Australia. Former Miss Australia winner and nurse Anita Cobby was abducted, raped, and decapitated. On Sunday morning, February 2nd, 1986, Anita got a call while she was getting ready for work from her husband asking if he should pick her up after work. She was working as a nurse in the surgical ward at Sydney Hospital until 3 p.m. that day, but she refused and said that she had plans with her friends and planned on sleeping at her parents' home. Little did they know that that would be their last time they ever spoke to each other. Anita and her two friends, Annette and Elaine, went to Redfern Restaurant that evening and had an amazing time. Around 8:30 p.m. that evening, Elaine, who lived in Crow's Nest, offered Anita to stay at her place that night, but Anita said no because she wanted to sleep in since her shift the next day started at 1:30. Now, Annette then drove Anita to the Central Railway Station so she could board the train to Blacktown, where her parents lived. Now, by the time Anita arrived at Blacktown Railway Station, it was pretty late. And usually when she arrived late at that station, her father would pick her up. But unfortunately, Anita tried looking at the payphones and they were vandalized. So she tried checking out the nearby taxi stand, but there was no available taxi. Cell phones weren't popular back then. So Anita looked around, nothing was available. And she thought to herself, well, her house is only 2 kilometers away, which is around a 20-30 minute walk. So she didn't think much of it since she grew up in that town and decided to walk home. Let's talk about Anita Cobby. According to her friends, she was gorgeous, kind, and full of life. She regularly participated in beauty pageants and had won the Miss Western Suburbs beauty pageant in 1979, along with many others. After graduating high school, Anita followed her mother's footsteps and decided to enroll into nursing school. Many people in the beauty industry did tell Anita that she was beautiful and if she wanted, she could have a career in modeling and acting, but she wanted more in life. She was so kind-hearted that she wanted to make a difference in people's lives, and she saw that her mother was doing that. So she decided to become a nurse. During her training in nursing school, she met John, who was also a fellow nurse. They fell in love and decided to get married. According to John, when he saw Anita, it was love at first sight. He allegedly was dating another girl at the time he met Anita, and apparently he did have strong feelings for this ex-girlfriend. But he couldn't help the strong attraction he had for Anita. John never thought he could even get with Anita if he ever had a chance with Anita. He just had this really strong attraction to her. And one day, Anita passed by John in the hallway and she struck up a conversation with him. And instantaneously, they clicked. And from that moment on, they were inseparable. He broke up with his girlfriend and then asked Anita out on a date. For their first date, they went to a restaurant and talked for hours. They loved the food there and the atmosphere of the restaurant so much that they went there often. And Anita and John became friends with the staff and the owner. Everyone who knew them or saw them knew how much they loved each other and how happy they were. 6 months after they started dating, they moved in together, and a year after they started dating, they were engaged. Some people may consider this moving too fast, but for Anita and John's case, everyone believed that they could not live without each other. If there's an Anita, there's a John. If there's a John, there's Anita. They were two peas in a pod. Soon after, their happiness doubled, and they found out that she was pregnant. Sadly, however, They did have a miscarriage, but that devastating moment didn't waver their love for each other. Shortly after, Anita and John had a small Catholic wedding and only invited their close family and friends. Instead of having a honeymoon, they decided to put the money they had towards renting a house, eventually got 2 dogs, and bought a boat. Anita and John loved their life. They loved being free, loved being outdoors. Both worked hard during the week, and on the weekend they would grab their dogs and sail on their boat. Few years later, Anita and John moved to Coffs Harbour. Anita got a job as a nurse at the local hospital, and John trained horses by day, and at night he was a nurse. A year later, one of John's friends flew down, and they both went to the races, where John placed a bet on one of his horses. In the end, John ended up winning $10,000, and with that money, Anita and him traveled and enjoyed life. He knew Anita had dreams of going to places, so he wanted to make those dreams come true. Once they were back home, John realized that he had enough of traveling, having fun with his friends and wife. He wanted more. He wanted to start a family and have children. Anita, however, wanted to continue traveling, continue hanging out with friends, and do just coupley things and not have the responsibility of having a child just yet. Now, this led to many arguments and caused them to drift apart since they wanted very different things and they were in different stages in their life. In the end, they decided to take a break from their marriage. Not a breakup, not a divorce. They just wanted hit pause for a bit. And Anita canceled their lease and moved in with her parents, and John moved in with his mother and sister. Now, who would have guessed that 6 weeks after Anita moved in with her parents and walked along the familiar road home, it would lead to the worst night of Anita's life and eventually her death. Now let's head back to the night of Anita's murder. What we know so far is that Anita decided to walk home the 2 kilometers and she never made it home. The next morning, her parents realized she wasn't home, but they didn't worry too much since she is a grown adult and knew that she was out with friends and figured she probably slept over at a friend's home. Her parents started to worry when they received a call from her work asking where Anita was. Her colleagues, boss, family, friends, they all knew Anita as a responsible, punctual adult who was never late for work or any appointment. And if in the off chance she was, she would call in and let them know. Right away, her parents went to the police station to file a missing report with a picture in hand. Once they were home, they called everyone that Anita knew to see if they had heard her or if they had seen her. Later that evening, the parents decided to call John Cobby, and immediately he went to Anita's parents' home and also helped them calling people and asking people if they had seen or heard from Anita. Now the next day, the police received a disturbing call from a local farmer. The police went to the farm called Reen Farm and saw a horrifying scene. The farmer told the police that morning he saw the cows in the pasture huddled together, but didn't think much of it. They're cows. They're huddled together. Okay. So he went on with their day. Few hours later, he saw the exact same thing. All his cows huddled together in one spot. That's when he started feeling like, okay, something is a little weird. Let me go check it out. He got into his little motorbike / ATV and he went up to his cows and they saw that they were hiding something. So when he worked his way around the cows, he saw a naked body lying face down and covered in blood. As he continued to look at the body, he knew that this woman was tortured beyond belief. And right away, he called the police. Now, when the police came, they asked him some routine questions, and the farmer did mention he heard a scream late at night that did wake him up. But he didn't think much of it since That road is also known to be a lover's lane. Like teenagers come, they get drunk, they have fun in his fields, and there's usually screaming and laughing. So he just thought that the scream that he heard last night was just a bunch of teenagers having fun. Never did he think in a million years that this scream would belong to a woman that was getting tortured. Now, the police tried to look for an ID but couldn't find anything. However, they did notice a unique Russian interlocking ring on her finger, so they hoped to identify the body with that. The police turned the body over and saw her eyes were still wide open, and there was a clear look of horror and pain on her face. After the police were done with the crime scene, they went to the station and started looking through the missing persons reports and came across Anita Cobby's report. They saw the picture that the father Gary had brought into the station and compared it to the woman's body they had found. They were 99% sure that this body was Anita Cobby. But to make sure, they had to ask the parents to come in and confirm. Now, when the parents came, they brought the ring to them, and right away the parents confirmed that this ring belonged to Anita Cobby. The sister, though, was a little hesitant because she's like, well, this ring is rusty, it's dirty, and Anita never keeps her jewelry like that. She's very spick-span, clean girl, keeps her jewelry in tip-top shape. And the officers were hesitant, but they said, it's not dirt, it's dried blood. And from there, you could tell the parents wondered, like, what did their daughter go through that even her jewelry has dried blood on it. The police then turned to John and asked him to come and identify the body, but he said he couldn't do it and how he wasn't able to see her in that state. Grace, who was Anita's mother, said that she could do it since she's seen dead bodies before because she's a nurse. However, the police said no because they knew the state Anita was in, and as a woman and a mother, they couldn't let her see her. Gary then stepped up and said that he will go to the morgue and confirm the body. Now, when Gary walked into the morgue and he saw Anita's body lying on the table, he took one look at the body and said, "I wish I could say that's not my daughter, but then it would be someone else's daughter, and they would be going through the exact same thing I'm going through." He knew she went through something worse than hell, and he completely broke. Now, the police right away decided to put a team together that would look after this case. Now, in most murder cases, they look at the people closest to Anita, and that's what they did in this case. They brought in John Cobby for questioning. They believed he was behind it since him and Anita had separated 6 weeks prior, and they got an anonymous tip from an alleged close family member saying how they should investigate the husband since he was obsessed with her. Shortly after, another tip came in accusing John of saying things about Anita. The police started asking him questions about their marriage. What happened? Why did they separate? How were things before? And eventually asking for his alibi for Sunday night. John told them that he was alone at home. He came from work and stayed there until the next morning when he went back to work. Officers and detectives did not believe him. They were suspicious of him because in most murder cases, the spouse or the partner is the culprit of the deceased. And his alibi wasn't solid. There was no way to confirm if he was at home alone. The police believed his motive was that he wasn't over Anita and he was jealous, and that made him torture and murder Anita. At this point, the police kept pushing and accusing John of killing Anita, asking why would he do such a thing, that he should admit to it. They even got physical with him. According to John, they slammed him to the ground, pushed him to the wall, and even slammed his face to the wall and repeatedly kept saying for hours, "You did this, just admit it," to try and force a confession. Little did they know that John and Anita had started seeing each other once again, and they were already gonna look at houses to rent and move in together. John was in love with Anita. He was head over heels with her, and he felt so guilty and blamed himself for her death. He kept thinking, why, that morning when he called her asking if he should pick her up from work, did he not push some more? Why didn't he offer to pick her up after the dinner date with her friends? If he had done so, none of this would have happened, and Anita would still be here. Because of this guilt, the fogginess of his brain, and after hours of questioning, and the physical abuse and the constant blame of him doing it and how he should admit to it, John admitted to the murder. The investigators finally had a confession like how they wanted. But then they realized that even though that they have this confession, they weren't satisfied. Something didn't add up. Their guts were saying that something is off. And they knew at the back of their minds that this confession was forced. So they went back to the autopsy report. The investigators realized that the wounds Anita had suffered were very different from each other. That it was a clear indication that multiple people were a part of this, not just one. And the wounds, the weapons, the extent to which she was brutalized could not have been possible by one person in such a short amount of time. Eventually, they did rule John out, and sadly, there was no one else on the suspect list since they were so focused on John up until this point. So they continued to search and dig, and they couldn't figure out who was behind it and what the motive was. They had no leads. They then started looking at local sex offenders near the train station and the route home from Blacktown Station to her house, and anyone that had a history of violent crimes against women, but they were all ruled out. The media soon after found out about this case and did everything to push it out. Usually the police get upset because you don't know what the media will say, but because the suspect list was non-existent at this point, they encouraged the media to raise awareness, to spread the news in hopes to jog someone's memory or to call in and give a tip. A little bit later, a very well-known morning radio DJ, John Laws, got a hold of Anita's autopsy report. He contemplated for hours if he should read it on air, and then decided that the public has a right to know. Before this, the public nor Anita's parents knew of what extent the brutality was. And once the public heard, let me remind you, this is a morning show. So a lot of people probably tune in when they're getting ready for work or when they're driving. So when these people heard it, first thing in the morning when they're getting their coffee or when they're getting ready, of what Anita went through, there was an outrage across Australia. Not just the town of Prospect, but the news spread like wildfire. Anita's parents were also upset because the police hid exactly what went on, and the police did that because they didn't want to hurt the parents even more. But to hear it broadcasted on a radio show, it was upsetting. But in the end, they were thankful because they knew that this was needed. That now everyone was talking about this case. That this case wasn't just another rape case that would be pushed under the rug if the culprit isn't found. Now, I will be talking about the autopsy report, what was found on it. Huge disclaimer right now. It is pretty graphic, and if you feel like you won't be able to hear what she went through, what the body went through, the pain she suffered, please skip to this timestamp. So on the autopsy report, the medical examiner mentioned Anita's body shows extensive bruising on her head, breasts, face, shoulders, groin, thighs, and legs, which were consistent with a systematic beating. Her breasts were so damaged, it seemed like someone had targeted them on purpose. She had lacerations on her hips, thighs, and legs from the barbed wire, several cuts to her neck. Her ear was nearly severed off her head. Her windpipe was severed. On one hand, most of her fingers were fractured. On the other hand, 3 of her fingers were nearly severed off, making it seem like she was trying to protect her face or throat from the knife. She had defensive wounds all along her arms and wrists. Her entire body was bloody and beaten. Her eye sockets were broken. Both of her eyes were completely black. Both of her cheekbones were broken, and both of her shoulders were dislocated. When her body was found, her eyes were wide open, indicating that she saw her killer. She was watching her killer. The force that the killer used to slice her throat was so great that she was nearly decapitated. Now, when this case went to trial, the medical examiner did come up and he said that the reports made by the radio station were altered and Anita was not mutilated apart from the slashing of her throat and hands, and there was no attack with a knife on her stomach or genitals, and her shoulders were not dislocated. After hearing about the autopsy in the morning radio show, everyone was struck with fear and hatred. People wanted justice, but more than that, they wanted blood. They wanted the killers to be given capital punishment. Everyone was talking about it. They started raising money, had protests, tried getting interviews with the police. The people of Australia were livid. The premier at that time offered a $50,000 reward for anyone who had information leading to the arrest of Anita's killers. Days later, the reward doubled. The pressure on the detectives grew immensely, which resulted in the decision to reenact Anita's last night in hopes it would jog the minds of those who passed by her. They got an officer to dress up like Anita and start the night how Anita did. Through this, they realized that Anita took the earlier train, not the one that they initially thought. And this led them to discovering that around that time, Anita would have been on Newton Road. And this caused the police to realize they got several calls from various different people in that area that night. The first call they received was from a 13-year-old boy and his 14-year-old sister, and they had heard a woman screaming. And when they went outside, they saw a woman getting grabbed by 2 men and being pushed into the car. The 13-year-old boy tried running to the car, but the car drove off. And at that moment, their older brother had come home and they told the brother what they saw. The brother, Paul, got back into the car and started searching for the woman and the car that his younger brother had described. Now the brother went up to Reen Road and did see a car that fit the description his brother gave. But when he went up to it, he shone his flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing seemed suspicious, there was no one in it or around it. So we thought maybe it was a coincidence that there's another car that fit the description. He then looked at the fields, shone his flashlight at the fields, and there was no one there. He tried listening, he couldn't hear anything, so he got back into his car and left. Now the police went up to this neighborhood, talked to the rest of the neighbors, followed up with the sister and brother, and got the description of the car. A few days later, the detective on this case got a tip that would lead to the case finally being solved and arresting Anita's killers. A police informant told the police that they had seen 3 men steal a car that fit the description of the car that had taken Anita that night. The man who was said to have stolen the car was John Travers. Now, the people of Blacktown knew of the name John Travers. They knew how he was, and they knew that he ran in a gang, and he was the leader of the gang. The other 2 men were Michael Murdoch, who was 18, and Leslie Murphy, who was 22. When the police heard that it was these 3 that stole the car and potentially were behind Anita's rape and murder, they sent 2 teams to go pick up the men once they located them. One team went to Travers' family home, and the second team went to Travers' uncle's home. Now, both teams forced entry and found Travers and Murdoch sleeping in the same bed at the uncle's home, and found Leslie at Travers' family home, and the reason being is because Leslie was dating Travers' sister. Now, when all 3 men were brought in for questioning, it wasn't for Anita. It was for questioning due to the car that they had stolen. Now, Leslie and Michael both admitted to stealing the car and were released on bail, but they were both put under surveillance. They had undercover cops watching their every move. Travers also admitted to stealing the car, but he made some shocking comments about Anita. So back when the team raided Travers' uncle's home, the police found a bloody knife. So when the police questioned Travers about it, he said, "I didn't slit the slut's throat." Now the police were a little taken back since they didn't even mention Anita. Now after this, the police decided to keep Travers in a holding cell. Now before we get into what happened next, let's talk about these boys. John Travers had a very hard childhood. He grew up in poverty, and allegedly his father would physically and sexually abuse him. Because of this, he turned to drugs and alcohol around the age of 12 and 13. By the time he was 14, he was totally dependent on these substances, which eventually got him kicked out of school. With this newfound free time, he would be on the street robbing people and stores so he could pay for his substances. His mother had had enough and sent him away in hopes that he would reform, but that didn't happen. When he returned from the reform program, his mother became very ill and couldn't care for him, so him and his siblings were put into foster care. Now, these kids separated, and with this change, he started becoming sexually violent, and not just with people, but with animals as well. John told a story of how he once stole a sheep and was first planning on killing it and barbecuing it, but before he did, he sodomized it and slit its throat at the same time. Now, seeing the sheep in this state gave him this satisfaction, this gratification, this pleasure, which later was confirmed that he did ejaculate in the sheep's wound. Michael Murdoch was John's best friend. He considered him to be John's sidekick, found him super cool and wanted to be just like him. He also grew up in poverty like John, but there were no reports of physical, mental, or sexual abuse from his family. However, as soon as he met John, they had a very similar lifestyle. Michael did everything exactly like John. Robbing stores, doing drugs, getting kicked out of school. It's like Michael was another John. The third name was Leslie Murphy, and he had a history of robbery and petty crime. The other 2 were Leslie's older brothers, Gary and Michael Murphy. Besides John, the group didn't have any history of violent crime or crime against women. Like previously mentioned, John Travers did have a history of rape allegations, so they took blood samples from him and kept him in the station. While in the holding cell, Travers asked if he could call his aunt to bring him cigarettes. The police asked for the aunt's number and called her. She immediately told the police that she needed to speak to them about John Travers and how she wanted to speak with them for the last couple of days but didn't know how to go about it. The aunt and the detectives decided to meet up that night. Around 6 p.m. that night, 2 detectives met with the aunt and said she immediately looked uncomfortable. So they decided to take her to their unmarked police car to make her feel comfortable. Once she got into the car, the aunt opened up. She said she had a bad feeling for the last couple of weeks that somehow Travers was involved in Anita's murder. Travers had a history of telling the aunt about all the crimes he committed in the past, from petty to violent crimes. Even whenever he would commit any type of sexual assault, he would tell the aunt. But this time, he didn't tell the aunt. The aunt just had a bad feeling that he was involved. The police then decided to come up with a plan. They told the aunt to come to the station and bring him his cigarettes like he requested, and while she was with Travers, she would have a hidden mic/tape recorder on her. The officers then wanted the aunt to gradually bring up the topic of Anita without raising any suspicion to get a confession. A few days later, the aunt came to the police station bringing cigarettes like Travers had requested, and she struck up a normal conversation. And just like she predicted, he opened up about Anita. The way she started up the conversation was asking if he ever had sex with Anita. She made sure she wouldn't use the word rape because she wanted him to feel comfortable and be open and didn't want to seem like she was fishing for something. He did say he did have sex with Anita and continued to say 4 other men were involved. He told her the entire story of what happened that night and just laughed through it like he was showing off and he had absolutely no remorse. He then asked the aunt for help, asking her to go back to his parents' house to find his favorite knife with the brown handle, which he used to kill Anita, and then also find his jeans, which were bloody from the night, to get rid of it, and lastly, go to Leslie Murphy's home and tell him to get rid of the car. Additionally, John came up with a plan to get out of the holding cell. Right next to the police station was a train station, so he told his aunt to go up to the train station and derail one of the trains so the train can go off the tracks and hit the back of the police station. And then with the hole in the station and no one really paying attention to him, he will escape. This plan was ridiculous, and I guess he kind of realized that too, because right away he came up with a new plan. He asked the aunt to go speak with Michael Murdoch and Leslie Murphy and to get them to come to the station with guns drawn between 3 and 3:30 a.m. because that's when there's the least number of officers at the station. Obviously, the aunt did not follow through with these plans. Everything was recorded, and when the police heard the recording, they knew that he was trying to escape. Now, people did wonder why all of a sudden the aunt decided to shed a light to Travers's deeds when before she knew of everything. She knew about when he would rape. She knew about when he would commit crime, but she never said anything. But now, why is it now she wants him to get arrested? Well, when she was asked, she said it was because no woman should ever go through what Anita went through. The police now had a full confession. They knew that all 5 people were responsible, but they wanted to make sure, so they decided to get a second confession from another member of the group. They were just doing that because just in case this recording shows up in trial, which it would have, they didn't want John to full out deny it. They wanted someone else from the group to also confirm. So the aunt went to Michael Murdoch's home with the recording device, and she started off saying how Travers admitted to everything and how she knows everything, and then she went on and asked what had happened in his own words. First, Michael didn't admit to anything, but he did leak some tidbits of similar things that also Travers had said. So in the end, police did have a confirmation of the confession, which would hold up in court. Once the police reviewed the information, they immediately went to go arrest them. After the police went to Travis's parents' house to search for the murder weapon and the clothes. 2 days later, they found the last two men. Now, when Gary Murphy saw the police were there, he ran out of the back door into the garden to escape. But of course, the police had the entire house surrounded and tackled him right away. And as soon as the handcuffs came on his hands, he peed himself. He was that scared of the police that he literally peed himself. So in 22 days, all 5 men were arrested and charged. They then took the men to where Anita was initially kidnapped and told them to reenact and tell them exactly what happened that night, explain it step by step, and where they went. We now know that she took the 8:48 p.m. train from Central Railway Station to Blacktown Station, and when she got to Blacktown Station, she was going to call her dad, but all the pay phones were vandalized. And she went to go check the taxi stand. There were no taxis, so she decided to walk the 2 kilometers home. Now, around that time, these 5 men were driving down the street. They were drunk, they were high from drugs, and they were looking for a good time. John Travers was the first one who saw Anita, and he told the driver to slow down and pull up right in front of Anita. Then he and Michael jumped out of the car and grabbed Anita and pushed her into the back seat while beating her so she would stop screaming and fighting. Once she was inside the car, they forced her to take her clothes off. Anita was screaming and kicking, and they kept punching her face. She kept saying that she's on her period and that she's married, but they did not care. Instead, they just beat her even more. They did stop at a gas station to put gas in the car that they had stolen, and before entering the gas station and while putting the gas in, they pushed Anita all the way down towards the feet of the back and held a knife to her throat so she wouldn't scream. Once they put a bit of gas in, they took money from Anita's wallet to pay. Then the men drove down to Reen Road, and when they got to the field, they told her to go to the certain part of the field. But she was so physically broken from the beatings that she could not move at all. So the men dragged her through a barbed wire fence and continually sexually and physically assaulting her for an hour and a half, taking turns. Until this point, the men all agreed with what happened that night. But now they started arguing. They argued with who exactly wanted Anita dead. Majority did say that in the end it was a unanimous decision that they should kill her since she knew what they looked like. And they encouraged Travers to kill her. Travers then took his knife and slit her throat, so deep that she was nearly decapitated. It is believed that from the time her throat was slit to the time that she died, it was 2 minutes. The men then took her clothes and their clothes besides John Travers and burnt them. John didn't burn his clothes because he wanted to keep it, because he felt like looking at it made him feel good. Now, when trial began for these men, it was insane. There were so many people outside waiting for these men. When the men were transferred into cars, the people surrounded them. The police had to drive super slowly. People were campaigning for the death penalty, but at that time, the death penalty was abolished from New South Wales. People came from all over Australia to the courts to show their support and try to push for capital punishment. They made signs saying it and even made a dummy that was hanging from a rope around his neck to make it crystal clear what they wanted. Now, Anita's parents didn't hold any anger towards the killers. They didn't forgive them, but they believed being angry towards the killers and having those negative thoughts were only going to harm themselves. So they took that and started raising awareness for women to make better decisions and be safer. The parents wanted to remember and honor Anita's life and not associate it with any type of hate. With Anita, she couldn't do anything else. Her only option was to walk. The payphones were out of service and there were no taxis. But Grace and Gary made it a point that if there is an option, get a ride or use a phone. Don't think, oh, my home is right there and this town is safe, I'll just walk. John Cobby fell into drug and alcohol abuse after Anita's death. He believed that in a way he wanted to die accidentally overdosing and didn't have the courage to kill himself. Later on, he did get help. He went in and out of the psych hospitals and was left with the severe mental health issues. Years later, he started dating again, got married, had kids, but he did change his name. The reason why he changed his name is because mentally it got to a point where he couldn't even say the name Cobby without thinking of Anita. So he changed his name to John Francis. 2 decades later, John realized that he was just running from his past and he needed to embrace it. So with the help of his son, he changed his last name again back to Cobby. Even his son changed his name just to support his dad. Now back to the aunt. John Travers was really well connected to dangerous men. And these men did find out that the reason these 5 boys are in jail and why it got revealed to the police was because of the aunt. So the aunt started receiving death threats, and her boyfriend, who was Travis's uncle, and their kids had to be put into the witness protection program. Now, after 3 decades in 2019, Gary Murphy was seen being transferred from Sydney's Prince of Wales Hospital to Long Bay Jail after he spent several weeks at the hospital recovering from injuries sustained when he was attacked by several men in a shower block. Michael Murray died in jail from liver cancer in February 2019 at the age of 66. Everyone else is still in jail, and many prisoners do not like them. Once they hear that these are the men associated with Anita's case, they beat them, they rape them, they do torturous things to them. Well, that is it for today's case. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye.